Looking back from a 21st century perspective, it might seem incredible to us that in the 1930s, the name Enterprise was not an especially notable one in the US Navy's history. To be sure, there had been half a dozen previous enterprises, including one in the Continental Navy, and some of them had been involved in notable conflicts, but given that these prior ships amounted to 3 schooners, 2 sloops, and an 8-man motorboat, it was primarily her original predecessor's role in the Continental Navy that caused the selection of the name Enterprise for one of the US Navy's planned new aircraft carriers, as the Continental Navy had also seen the service of a Lexington, a Saratoga, and a Ranger. The odd ones out in the US carrier fleet were the Langley, named after an early American aviation pioneer, so that was somewhat forgivable, and of course the planned class lead for the new Enterprise, the USS Yorktown, was also a bit of an anomaly, since with Yorktown being the last battle of the American War of Independence, you obviously wouldn't have a ship in the Continental Navy named after a battle that hadn't happened yet. CV-6 would, of course, start a rather major shift in the name recognition of a ship called Enterprise, but all of that was for the future at the start of the 1930s, when the US Navy was pondering what exactly it wanted for its first true purpose-built aircraft carriers. Now, granted, USS Ranger had been built from the keel up as a carrier, but she'd been subjected to many limitations due to constraints placed on her displacement, and she'd been substantially designed before Lexington and Saratoga had even entered service. Whereas the new carrier class would not only have operational experience to take into consideration from those ships, but the requirements of what made a good carrier design would have a bit more influence over the ship's overall size and thus capabilities. The starting point was, of course, how much tonnage was left to the US Navy's carrier fleet under the then current treaty restrictions. It turned out this amounted to about 52,000 tons, and the choices seemed to therefore be either build 4 more ships of a similar capacity to the Ranger, build 3 somewhat larger ships at just over 18,000 tons apiece, or 2 much larger ships at around 27,000 tons each. The first 2 options ran into the problem that the US Navy had at this point decided that 2 similar carriers working together was a good operational unit, a similar conclusion to that the Japanese were coming to. A total of 5 Ranger-type carriers would leave 1 as an odd one out. Building 3 slightly larger carriers would of course still leave Ranger as the odd one out, but also one of the new ones would be odd as well. And that left the last option for the 27,000 tonners, which was favoured by some, but others in the US Navy were somewhat more cautious. The choice would still leave Ranger alone, and it would limit the US Navy to 5 large carrier hulls, at a time when fleet problems were suggesting that carriers might be suffering some rather high attrition rates in actual combat. And 5 fleet carriers, of course, meant that the loss of any one hull meant a 20% reduction in overall carrier strength. And so a compromise was suggested. They could build another ship of approximately Ranger's displacement, which could pair up with her, plus 2 further ships which could displace a bit over 20,000 tons. This would then give the fleet 3 pairs, each of which was made up of similar carriers, and increase the overall hull count by 1 compared to the previous 27,000-tonner option, which would in turn mean that a lost carrier only represented 16 2/3% of the total carrier force. It was further decided to progress the larger designs first, in the hopes that lessons learned from them would allow the smaller carrier, which would be paired up with Ranger, to become a more efficient design, although initial sketch designs for both types would be prepared simultaneously. That allocated tonnage for the smaller carrier would of course eventually become USS Wasp. The wish list of specifications drawn up for the new pair of fleet carriers was therefore as follows: a 32.5 knot top speed, a reasonable torpedo defense system. It was understood that a full battleship spec system wasn't required or indeed possible, but something a little bit more ambitious than what was found on cruisers was definitely going to be needed. Also, protection against cruiser-grade gunfire. This was thrown into the equation after Lexington and Saratoga had experienced problems being chased down by cruisers in the fleet problems. Next, an armor deck to protect the magazines and the fuel tanks for the air group and, of course, the ship's machinery. More and better hangar space as a percentage of ship size relative to the earlier vessels, along with better ways to move aircraft to the flight deck. Then better anti-aircraft capabilities, and finally, in the original specification wish list, was multiple flight decks. This was to allow heavily laden strike aircraft to use the primary flight deck, while lighter fighter aircraft could launch straight from the hangar. This would be in common with the layout seen on British and Japanese converted aircraft carriers that were entering service at the time, such as Akagi, Kaga, Courageous, and Glorious. Optional, but still hoped-for features included either a full flush deck or a very small island, Ranger style, and possibly a smaller secondary hangar deck below the main one, which could be used for maintenance, assembly of spare aircraft, and the repair of damaged aircraft, thus allowing the main hangar deck to be used entirely by the active air group. This latter feature would need no less than 4 aircraft elevators, 2 positioned towards the middle, which could access both hangars, and 1 at each extreme end, which would only service the main hangar. On top of this ambitious list of requirements was a discussion about gun armament, with some arguing that 5-inch dual-purpose guns would be perfectly fine against both surface and air threats, while others argued that, as fine an anti-aircraft weapon as the 5-inch was, the lack of 8-inch armament, like found on the Lexingtons, would mean that these new carriers could only ever serve in support of the main battle line, since there they could fend off the odd destroyer with their 5-inch armament, and they could rely on the fleet for protection against anything bigger. Whereas if you wanted to undertake true independent operations, they held that the ships would of course need guns to duel any cruiser they might come across, and a 5-inch gun just wouldn't cut it for those purposes. Now, it might be apparent to some of you already that this was effectively a completely impossible set of demands, since the much larger and later Essex class don't even quite meet this list. And of course, as with all development programs, the whole thing almost immediately got thrown into confusion anyway, as further experience suggested that a Ranger-type carrier would be less able to operate aircraft in heavy seas, so the tonnage arguments pivoted again to look at either a trio of ships of just over 18,000 tons, or 2 ships just under 21,000 tons, with major emphasis placed on speed, as a new idea was to assign a carrier to each heavy cruiser division, and thus the flat top would need to keep up with them. As at this point the US Navy was very much of the notion that carriers were a force multiplier for the fleet's scouting force, far more than they were part of the striking power of the battle force. Another argument was over where to place the deck protection. Should it be deeper in the ship over the vitals and capping the ship's belt armor, or should it be higher in the ship on the flight deck? The president of the Naval War College advocated for an armored flight deck on the grounds that, under the current fleet wargaming rules, a single bomb hit wiped out half the flight deck's operational capability, i.e. it left the carrier able to either launch or land aircraft, but it couldn't do both. And 2 bomb hits were counted as rendering the flight deck completely useless for any air operations at all. He explained that although carriers were not yet seen as decisive elements of the fleet in and of themselves, they did influence the various factors that brought the battle lines together, and of course in what condition those 2 fleets might meet. And so, in repeated exercises and wargames, the first priority had been to neutralize the enemy's air threat, and this had shown that prior thinking that had thought that perhaps with enough fighters you could dominate the skies had been faulty, as no reasonable number of carrier-based fighters had completely stopped bombers from getting through, and when you only needed a couple of hits to neutralize the capability of a carrier, it wasn't too hard to lose your ability to operate aircraft entirely. A carrier, no matter how quick, simply couldn't outrun a dive bomber, But a swift carrier with an armoured flight deck should be able to outpace any cruiser, and if the flight deck could resist bomb hits, it would then be able to continue to operate aircraft well past the point where the enemy carriers, presumably without armoured flight decks, would be knocked out, thus ensuring a victory. As it would leave you with uncontested aerial scouting capacity and almost uncontested strike capacity. The fleet would still have its anti-aircraft guns after all, but there would be no further fighter opposition. And that would be a significant advantage to the friendly battle fleet as they headed into combat. But all of this was up against other admirals who thought that the threat of enemy cruisers, or perhaps battle cruisers, was much, much greater than the President of the War College thought, and thus they held that armour should be reserved lower down to resist shell hits rather than placed higher up to resist bomb hits. In the end, what tipped the balance of this particular debate was the long, perhaps accursed, shadow of Billy Mitchell. Although it was possible to armour the developing design's flight deck against the then-current dive bomber payload of an approximately 500-pound bomb, Mitchell's legacy had left some under the impression that a level bomber, flying at 4,000 feet, could not only survive, but could accurately drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a moving target like a carrier. And the level of protection that was needed to stop a 2,000-pound bomb was far in excess of what could be reasonably fitted atop the new carrier designs. So, given the desire for a large air group, which needed a large hangar, which would need to be sacrificed to get the flight deck to a point where it might be able to withstand a 2,000-pound bomb impact, those who advocated for armour that was more oriented to repel surface attack won the day. Debate then moved on to the two-level flight deck idea, i.e. the capacity of launching aircraft out of the hangar as well. The idea for this was supported by some who had witnessed what they saw as two major issues. Firstly, they'd seen that although the Lexingtons could fly off huge numbers of aircraft, they couldn't land any of them until the deck load had been cleared. And secondly, in some situations, increasingly poor sea conditions had prevented cruisers and capital ships from launching their own scout aircraft, leaving the carriers as the only ships which could launch any aircraft at all, and so if the fleet needed recon but the carrier had preloaded a strike package on deck, it turned out it was actually faster to launch that entire strike package to clear the deck to bring up the scout aircraft, launch them, and then land all of the strike aircraft, rather than play the various puzzle games rearranging aircraft on the deck to try and get the scouts up and manoeuvre them to the front of the deck park. The idea of the two-deck launching system, therefore, was to allow scouts or fighters to be launched at any time, regardless of what happened to be going on the main flight deck above them, and would also help to speed up overall launch rates to allow aircraft to be recovered faster as well, since you could just launch a strike aircraft from the main flight deck and perhaps all your fighters could come from the hangar. But this was opposed on a couple of grounds. Firstly, the lower-level launching facility would of course be closer to the waterline, and it was felt there was a risk that high seas might then send water cascading over the bow, picking up any aircraft that might be being made ready to launch, and then sending this mixture of water, aircraft and flight deck crew cascading through the hangar deck, wiping out most of the air group. And secondly, it would also involve shortening the main flight deck, which might then impose limits on what future aircraft could be handled, as heavier and larger aircraft would of course need longer takeoff runs. There was also some concern about the fume levels in the hangar, as the amount of exhaust produced by an aircraft ticking over or warming up prior to being taken up to the flight deck was radically less than that of an aircraft which had ramped its engine up to maximum power in an attempt to take off, let alone several aircraft doing this. Of course, how bad this effect would be would scale with how enclosed the hangar deck happened to be. It was felt a possible solution might be to retain the single flight deck but to adopt British carrier practices which involved having a relatively small number of aircraft up on deck and then bringing more up to launch as needed, plus recovering any landed aircraft back to the hangar immediately. It was argued that, admittedly, this might slow down air operations a bit too much for the US Navy's liking, but this might in turn be countered by installing more and faster aircraft elevators. In the end, neither one of these ideas was wholly adopted, but a compromise solution was reached. The carriers would have 3 or 4 elevators to improve cycle time to and from the hangar, as they'd also be faster and larger, but they would also have a hangar-level catapult which launched aircraft sideways out of the ship. This would in theory allow for the operation of a small number of scout aircraft or a handful of fighters, no matter what happened to be occurring on the flight deck, while also keeping the front end of the hangar fully enclosed, albeit at the expense of having to keep the area around the catapult clear while flight operations were taking place, just in case it was needed. It was also decided to fit the flight deck such that aircraft could take off or land in either direction. Most commonly, this is known to allow the carrier to recover aircraft even if the aft end was damaged and you just put the thing in reverse, but it was also considered that this might allow the carrier to operate aircraft in normal conditions if the enemy happened to be to windward and therefore the ship couldn't sail into the wind. In that case, it could sail away from the wind, but in theory it would still have some wind over its flight deck coming from the aft, and therefore the aircraft could take off backwards. In the anti-aircraft department, it was thought that a battery of 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns should be enough to deal with level bombing attacks, while an initial fit-out of no less than 40 50 caliber machine guns was listed for use against dive bombers. Later, these would be supplemented, or in some cases replaced, with 1.1-inch guns. The main difference between the two displacement levels now under consideration for the bigger carriers was the effect on flight operations. Both could fit protection against heavy cruiser shells at long range and a limited torpedo defense system, made up of 3 compartments as opposed to a battleship's 5, but the larger ship could just about get away with 4 elevators instead of 3 that would be on the smaller type. The final debating point was, what did you put above the flight deck? Hopes by the Bureau of Aeronautics of having a small island with hinged funnels, like Ranger had, to provide a near flush deck for flight operations were dashed by the sheer volume of exhaust gas produced by a power plant that was needed to move the ship at 32.5 knots. Neither their overall effectiveness or the heat transmission of the ducting to the hinged funnels could be guaranteed with all this extra output, and it was likely that this amount of exhaust gases would cause disruption to the air currents behind the ship no matter where you happened to send it. And so, for overall space and weight reasons, it was decided, well, you might as well just vent everything via a single rather tall funnel, or stack, incorporated into the aft end of the island, as if it was tall enough, the aircraft could just fly under its disruption. It might come as a bit of a surprise given that we are talking about an aircraft carrier, but overall air group size was not actually really discussed that much at this stage. This was for 2 reasons. Firstly, early testing with the Lexingtons had revealed that theoretical and practical air group sizes were both wildly divergent and often subject to change even within a single operation. In theory, with a full hangar and a full deck park with just enough flying off space left forward, you could get 110 contemporary aircraft on a Lexington. But managing takeoff and landing with so little free space was essentially impossible. In fleet problems, it had also been found that although you could get 82 aircraft out on deck ready for a dawn strike, if you then wanted to conduct further operations during the day, you had to leave some space aft for landing, and your deck spot then dropped to 52. So on those grounds, working out exactly how many aircraft the new carriers could operate was felt better left to final design and then operational testing. The other factor was the changes being made in the early 1930s to the US Navy's air groups, which might change the overall air group capacity of a carrier by changing the makeup of said air group, and thus the size of the aircraft. At the start of the decade, a carrier air group was made up of 1 squadron of torpedo bombers, 2 squadrons of fighters, with some of these being capable of carrying small bombs, and which included some dive bombers or fighters with dive bombing capability, a squadron of scouts, who were near enough purely scout aircraft with very minimal weapons carrying capacity. But this was all facing change. One proposal was to drop the torpedo bomber squadron entirely, which would leave you with 1 squadron of heavy dive bombers capable of lofting a 1,000-pound bomb, another squadron of large fighters armed with 500-pound bombs, another squadron of scouts, and another squadron which would be purely fighters. The larger fighters would be capable of some limited dive bombing. Alternatively, you could have a loadout of 1 squadron of torpedo bombers, 1 squadron of heavy dive bombers, 1 squadron of fighters, again with 500-pound bombs and some dive bombing capability, another squadron of 2-seat long-range fighters, which could double as scouts. Thus, the overall makeup of future air groups at the time could not be clearly foreseen, and indeed it wouldn't be until the Enterprise was about ready to enter service, as it turned out, that the setup that's familiar to World War II carrier history enthusiasts, that being 1 fighter squadron, 1 torpedo bomber squadron, 1 dive bomber squadron, and another set of dive bombers using lighter bombs and serving as scouts, would finally be settled across the fleet. At this stage, it was decided that the category of design that was just over 18,000 tons was actually just a bad compromise between the reduced capabilities of a Ranger-type carrier and the much better capabilities of a ship that displaced 20,700 tons, and so that size category was dropped. Now, all the debates we've just covered can be seen in a trio of 20,700-ton designs that were produced in 1931, in the start of the year. Designs D, E, and F. Designs A through C had looked at what might be done with Ranger levels of displacement and are so more appropriate to a discussion about the USS Wasp. Design D offered the double flight deck option with a 77-strong air group. Design E offered a single armoured flight deck with a 74-strong air group, and Design F offered protection against 6-inch gunfire instead of 8-inch, so light cruiser instead of heavy cruiser, a single flight deck, 90 aircraft, and a degree of torpedo defence. This design was the most favoured, especially as the 18,400-ton Design G was used as a counterpoint and comparison. This design offered a smaller air group, very minimal armour protection, a less capable torpedo defence system, and a shorter flight deck compared to Design F, and it didn't cost all that much less. But increasing aircraft size and weight, plus a desire for a few other features, now saw brand new designs requested. The Ranger-type designs that had been paralleling this process had been specified at 13,800 tons, but none of them were really that satisfactory, as the compromises that were needed to get them up to 32.5 knots meant other areas had to be sacrificed quite badly, and Ranger was already a very bad compromise in some respects. So, given overall tonnage limits, as per the treaties, it was decided to take 700 tons of displacement off each of the 2 larger carriers, thus reducing them to 20,000 tons, which would then allow the smaller ship, which would be built later, to grow to 15,200 tons displacement. This, of course, meant a new design, Design I, for the big carriers. The loss of 700 tons of displacement was paid for by a reduction in the number of elevators from 4 to 3, and the torpedo defence system and its associated bulkheads were halved, along with a 5-foot reduction in overall length of the ship. In theory, the design should now be finalised and put out to tender. But late in 1931, a brand new set of requests came in. Continued experience had showed that some people really liked the 8-inch guns on the Lexingtons, so could maybe some designs be prepared to include these weapons? Perhaps, they said, in full-scale turrets mounted forward. This would involve a reduction in hangar and flight deck length, but hey, it would be cool. Relevant to the larger carriers, A 20,000-ton design, along with two more at 25,000 and 27,000 tons, were developed. These mounted 6, 9, and 10 8-inch guns, respectively, but resulted in a drop of air group to somewhere in the 60s, whereas comparatively, 25,000 and 27,000-ton proper carrier designs were also prepared, and even though these had an increased 16-gun 5-inch battery, they could each carry 100 or more aircraft of the latest types. Design I was also modified to see if perhaps 6-inch turrets, either mounted ahead, mounted abeam, or mounted adjacent to the island Lexington style, might be somewhat useful. The answer to all these attempts at creating battle carriers was fortunately a resounding no, and Design I in its original form was taken forward as the basis of the new carrier class. There was, of course, quite a lot of tweaking to do to this general outline. The island would be shifted around, as was the position of the anti-aircraft battery. Originally, this had been clustered right fore and right aft, but would now be placed on either side in galleries adjacent to the flight deck, which would allow the flight deck itself to be extended. The hangar was also made a little bit taller. The magazine and aircraft fuel storage was increased, as it was finally calculated that perhaps there wasn't enough room in the original spec, and belt and deck armour, of course, had to be extended to cover these new expanded explosive storage spaces, amongst other things. One particular headache was the torpedo defence system. Not only was it quite reduced compared to a battleship, but the shape of the hull meant that even a lightweight airdrop torpedo would probably just blow straight through what protection was there regardless, which meant the torpedo defence system was now almost useless deadweight, unless you counted some limited ability to absorb the blast from nearby shells or bombs that happened to miss the carrier. It was possible to address this somewhat by changing the hull shape, but this would mean more power was needed, as the new hull form would create more drag, and that in turn meant that a suggestion to alternate the boiler and turbine rooms had to be dropped, instead grouping all the boilers and all the turbines into single large sections, with the result being that if something did make it through the armour or the torpedo defence system, there was a real risk of a single breach completely disabling the ship. But it was held a torpedo defence system that might be capable of at least some torpedo defence was worth the compromise. A delay in construction due to a shortage of funds, thanks to the ongoing Great Depression, meant that more anti-aircraft guns were added. There was another fierce debate about exactly where they should be placed, and there was also a suggestion to drop torpedo storage completely and rely entirely on bombs for offensive action. The first suggestion was welcomed. The second suggestion saw some slight further rearrangement into the now familiar gallery system, and the latter issue, to drop the torpedoes, was fortunately refused entirely. The two Yorktown-class carriers were finally laid down in 1934, Yorktown in May and Enterprise in July. Enterprise would slide into the water in October 1936 and then spend a year and a half fitting out, finally commissioning in May 1938 and heading for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for her shakedown cruise under Captain White. Operating alongside her sister ship Yorktown the next year under Captain Pownall, in that year's fleet problem the two carriers would operate under the overall command of one Admiral Halsey, with the ship then fetching up in San Diego as she'd been assigned to the Pacific Fleet. Her first air group was huge, with 5 squadrons consisting of an 18-strong fighter squadron, a massive 37-strong squadron of scout bombers split between scouting and light attack roles, plus 18 torpedo bombers and 18 dedicated heavy dive bombers, and then a small 6-aircraft general-purpose squadron for a total of 97 operational aircraft. Fittingly, she was then used as a live set for the filming of the movie Dive Bomber. But in 1940, Hollywood activities done, she was moved along with the bulk of the Pacific Fleet to Hawaii, obviously to Pearl Harbor. By this point, her air group had dropped to a somewhat more manageable 84 operational aircraft, although there were 37 spares, mostly stored overhead in the hangar. She received a CX-AM-1 radar set and was scheduled to have her 1.1-inch and 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns replaced by 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons, but shortages of the latter weapons meant that this wouldn't actually occur until well after the US entered the Second World War. As war clouds gathered, Enterprise received a new captain, one George Murray, in March 1941, and she began a series of operations to deliver aircraft to various forward bases in the Pacific to strengthen them. And in this role, she was heading back to Pearl Harbor in early December 1941 with a scheduled return date of the 6th. However, heavy weather slowed her progress considerably, and on the morning of the 7th, she was still at least a day's sailing away. By this time, her air group was 72 active aircraft, 18 F-4F Wildcats of VF-6, 18 TBD Devastators of VT-6, and 36 SBD-2 Dauntlesses split between the heavy dive-bombing VB-6 and the scout and light dive-bombing VS-6. That morning, 18 of the Dauntlesses would be launched for a scouting exercise, with instructions to then proceed to land at Pearl Harbor in advance of the ship's arrival. This, of course, meant that they unwittingly showed up in the middle of the Kido Butai's assault on the naval facilities and ships at Pearl Harbor, which resulted in the loss of 7 of their number from a mix of Japanese fighters and friendly anti-aircraft fire that was just blasting anything in the air with wings. An attempted counterstrike by the remaining aircraft in Enterprise's air group was thwarted by the ship being incorrectly told that the Japanese carriers were to the southwest of Hawaii, when in fact they were more towards the northwest. This effort led to the loss of 4 aircraft as a number of Wildcats were diverted back to Oahu, and despite everyone being told that there were friendly aircraft incoming, the anti-aircraft defences opened up on them, shooting down 3, and another then ran out of fuel, with only the pilot of the one that ran out of fuel surviving. Enterprise then sailed into scenes of devastation at Pearl Harbor on the evening of the 8th of December, but was completely restocked before dawn on the 9th, and it was now time for USS Enterprise to go to war.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.